So you think you know philosophy? Let me guess. You saw some bearded dude in a toga on Instagram with a deep quote overlaid in Comic Sans and suddenly you re-Socrates reincarnated. Well, buckle up, buttercup, because we're about to take a journey through ancient Greece where the so-called greatest minds in human history were basically just drunk dudes in sandals having existential crises. And spoiler alert, they were probably high half the time too. Picture this. It's ancient Athens, roughly 400 BCE. And while your average peasant is busy not dying from dysentery, a bunch of privileged rich boys are sitting around asking profound questions like what is reality? And how do we know what we know? You know, instead of asking useful questions like why does my olive oil taste like ass? Or how do I stop my slaves from running away? But hey, when daddy's money keeps the bread coming, you can afford to ponder the universe instead of, contributing to society. Let's start with the OG himself, Socrates. This guy was basically the ancient world's version of that one friend who ruins every party by asking but what is a party? Really, he wandered around Athens bothering people with questions like some kind of philosophical stalker. The dude literally got so annoying that the entire city voted to kill him. Think about that. They had democracy, and they democratically decided this guy needed to shut up permanently. That's like if Twitter users could actually vote someone off the platform for being insufferable, except with hemlock instead of a suspension. Socrates claimed he knew nothing. Absolutely nothing. Which if you've ever met someone who says they know nothing while simultaneously lecturing you about everything, you know exactly how infuriating this man must have been. It's like that uncle who starts every sentence with, I don't know much about politics, but ... and then proceeds to explain why the government is secretly controlled by lizard people. The midnight meme historian in me wants to point out that Socrates basically invented mansplaining 2,000 years before we had a word for it. And what was his brilliant method? The Socratic method, which is just asking annoying questions until the other person either has an epiphany or wants to punch you in the face. What is justice? He'd ask some poor merchant. Well, treating people fairly, they'd reply. But what is fairness? He'd continue. Giving everyone what they deserve. But what do they deserve? And on until the merchant either achieved enlightenment or told Socrates to go find a bridge to jump off. It's basically ancient trolling, but instead of getting banned from forums, you get sentenced to death by drinking poison. The best part, this guy never wrote anything down. Not one single word. Everything we know about Socrates comes from his student Plato, which means we're getting the world's first fanfiction as historical fact. It's like if everything we knew about Einstein came from his lab assistant's blog posts. For all we know, the real Socrates was just some homeless guy who asked random questions and Plato turned him into philosophy's first superhero. Maybe Socrates actually said profound things like where's the bathroom and can you spare some change? But Plato wrote it down as the unexamined life is not worth living. Speaking of Plato, this guy took his teacher's annoying question habit and somehow made it worse by creating an entire imaginary world to explain reality. According to Plato, everything we see is just shadows on a cave wall, and the real world exists in some perfect dimension where there's a perfect chair, perfect justice, and presumably perfect Wi-Fi. It's like he invented virtual reality to millennia before the technology existed. Except instead of using it for gaming, he used it to explain why your chair sucks compared to the ideal chair that exists in philosophical heaven. Plato's Republic is basically ancient Greece's first dystopian novel, except he thought it was a utopia. His perfect society includes forced breeding programs, censorship of art, and philosopher kings ruling over everyone else. Sound familiar? That's because every dictator in history has read this thing and thought, you know what? This Plato guy gets it. It's like a how-to manual for authoritarian regimes, but dressed up in pretty philosophical language. He literally argued that democracy was bad because people are too stupid to govern themselves. And honestly, looking at our current political situation, maybe the guy had a point, but let's not give him too much credit. The man also invented the concept of platonic relationships, which is basically the philosophical equivalent of being friend-zoned. Sorry I couldn't be with you physically because I am too busy contemplating your perfect soul form in my imaginary dimension. It's the ultimate intellectual's excuse for commitment issues. Modern dating apps would have loved this guy. He could have written the most pretentious profile in history, looking for someone who can appreciate the eternal forms while rejecting the illusions of physical reality. Must be interested in caves, shadows, and philosophical enlightenment. No hookups, seeking soulmate in the literal metaphysical sense. But wait, it gets better. Plato also believed in reincarnation, which means according to his philosophy, some of you watching this video right now might be the reincarnated souls of ancient Greek sheep herders. And honestly, given the state of internet comment sections, that would explain a lot. Maybe that's why some people seem to have the intellectual capacity of livestock. They literally were livestock in a previous life. And have you quite figured out how thumbs work yet? Then there's Aristotle, Plato's student who basically looked at his teacher's perfect world theory and said, yeah, That's nice and all. But how about we actually study the real world instead of making up imaginary ones? Revolutionary concept, right? Only took humanity thousands of years to figure out that maybe we should observe reality instead of just thinking really hard about it. Aristotle was like the ancient world's first fact-checker, except instead of debunking political lies on social media, he was debunking his teacher's entire worldview. Aristotle classified everything, and I mean everything: animals, plants, governments, rhetoric, logic. This guy was like an ancient Greek Wikipedia editor on steroids. He created categories for categories. He organized the organization systems. If OCD was a philosopher, it would be Aristotle. The man could unsee a group of things without immediately sorting them into neat little boxes with labels. Modern internet culture would have driven him insane. Imagine trying to categorize TikTok dances or classify the different types of Instagram influencers. He'd have an existential breakdown trying to figure out where cryptocurrency fits in his economic classifications. But here's where it gets really good. This guy tutored Alexander the Great. That's right, the most famous conqueror in human history was taught by a philosopher. How's that for irony? Now, Alexander, remember what we learned about moderation and virtue, while you out there slaughtering your way across 3 continents. It's like having Mr. Rogers train John Wick. Aristotle spent years teaching this kid about ethics and justice, and Alexander's takeaway was apparently cool. Now I know the proper way to burn down perception. The midnight meme historian has to appreciate the cosmic joke here. You've got the father of logical thinking training history's most successful psychopath. It's like if Gandhi had personally trained Hitler in non-violence. Alexander probably sat through lectures about the golden mean while planning invasions in his head. Yes, teacher, temperance in all things. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to go practice temperance by moderately genociding only half of Persia. And that's just the warm-up act, folks. We've barely scratched the surface of philosophical insanity, and we're already seeing patterns that make modern politics look sane by comparison. But buckle up, because we're about to dive into the pre-Socratics, the OG weird kids who thought water was God and numbers were the secret to everything. These guys make flat earthers look like rocket scientists, and their ideas are still somehow more coherent than most social media debates. The real kicker: these 3 dudes, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, basically created the template for every insufferable intellectual for the next 2.5 millennia. Every guy who's ever corrected someone's grammar on Facebook, every person who's ever said, well actually at a party, every philosophy major who thinks reading Nietzsche makes them superior to the rest of humanity. They're all just following the playbook written by 3 Greeks who spent their lives asking questions that have no answers while pretending they were saving the world with their big brains. But here's the thing that really bake your noodle. We're still taking these guys seriously. Universities still teach their ideas like their gospel. Politicians still quote them to sound smart. Silicon Valley brothers still name their startups after Greek philosophical concepts while building apps that make people dumber. It's like using a Stone Age toolbox to fix a spaceship. But hey, at least the stone tools have prestige, right? So stick around, because we're just getting started on this philosophical freak show. Next up, we're diving into the real weirdos, the guys who thought everything was made of water, fire, or geometric shapes. You thought modern conspiracy theories were nuts? Wait until you hear about the dude who thought beans were evil and music could heal your soul. The ancient world was basically one giant philosophy convention where everyone was high and nobody fact-checked anything. Now that we've established that the holy trinity of Greek philosophy were basically just really articulate weirdos, let's talk about their intellectual ancestors. The pre-Socratics. These guys were the philosophical equivalent of that kid in school who ate glue and somehow convinced everyone he was a genius. They looked at the world around them and instead of thinking, wow, nature is complex and mysterious, they thought, I bet I can explain literally everything with one simple element. It's like trying to explain the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe by saying it's all about rocks. Man, first up is Thales, who basically invented philosophy by being wrong about everything in the most confident way possible. This dude looked at the world and declared that everything, and I mean everything, was made of water. Your chair, water your dog, water your existential dread, also water, but like, sad water. It's the kind of breakthrough thinking that makes you wonder if ancient Greeks had access to some really good drugs, or if they were just so bored that making stuff up seemed like a valid career choice. The best part about Thales, the guy was supposedly so smart that he could predict eclipses, but so absent-minded that he fell into a well while looking at the stars. A servant girl laughed at him and said he was so eager to know what was in the sky that he could unsee what was right in front of his feet. Basically, he was the original absent-minded professor, except instead of forgetting his keys, he forgot how gravity works. Modern academics should relate to this guy. Brilliant enough to understand celestial mechanics. Too stupid to watch where they're walking. But wait, there's more. Thales also thought the earth floated on water like a giant boat, which raises some interesting questions, like what's under that water? More water. Is it water all the way down? Did he think the universe was just one big swimming pool with continents as pool floats? This is the guy who supposedly founded Western philosophy. and his cosmology sounds like something a 5-year-old would come up with after spending too much time in the bathtub. Then we have Anaximander, who looked at Thales' water theory and said, "Hold my emperor." This genius decided that everything came from something called the boundless, which is basically the philosophical equivalent of saying I dunno, some stuff. It's the ultimate non-answer disguised as profound wisdom. Modern politicians learned everything they know about answering questions from this guy. Senator, what's your position on healthcare? Well, it all comes from the boundless, really. Anaximander also gave us the first recorded evolutionary theory, suggesting that humans evolved from fish, which, considering how people behave on the internet, might actually explain a lot. Maybe some of us just haven't fully evolved out of our aquatic phase yet. That would certainly explain Twitter discourse. It's just a bunch of barely evolved fish people flopping around making angry noises at each other. But the real comedy gold is Anaximenes, who looked at his predecessors and thought, you guys are both wrong. Everything is obviously made of air. Air, this dude thought your grandmother, your laptop, and the International Space Station were all just really thick air. It's like he discovered breathing and decided to make it his entire personality. He probably walked around ancient Greece huffing dramatically and saying things like, do you feel that? That's the fundamental essence of reality entering your lungs. These three water-air boundless enthusiasts were like the ancient world's first conspiracy theorists, except instead of claiming the government was controlled by lizard people, they were claiming reality was controlled by basic elements, and somehow, people took them seriously. They started schools, they had followers. It's like if someone today started a philosophy based on the idea that everything is actually mayonnaise, and universities began offering graduate degrees in Mayo studies. But the real winner in the crazy competition has to be Heraclitus, aka the weeping philosopher. This guy was so depressed by human stupidity that he spent his life crying about it. He's like the ancient Greek version of that friend who posts vague emo status updates on social media and then gets mad when people ask if they're okay. His most famous quote is, "You cannot step into the same river twice," which is either profound wisdom about the nature of change or the kind of thing people say when they re-high and think they've discovered the secrets of the universe. Heraclitus believed that everything was in constant flux, always changing, never the same, which honestly isn't that groundbreaking. Anyone who has ever tried to maintain a friendship or keep up with internet memes knows that everything changes constantly, but this guy made it his whole thing. He was like that person who discovers Buddhism and won't shut up about impermanence while completely missing the point about acceptance. The man also thought that fire was the fundamental element, which makes sense if you read the kind of person who cries all the time. You'd probably be obsessed with something that could dry your tears. He believed that the world was created and destroyed in endless cycles of cosmic fire. Basically, he invented the concept of this is fine dog meme 25 centuries before anyone knew what a meme was. Then there's Parmenides, who went in the complete opposite direction and declared that change was impossible. According to this guy, everything that exists has always existed and will always exist, and change is just an illusion. It's like he looked at Heraclitus crying about constant change and said, nah bro, you're just hallucinating. This is the philosophical equivalent of sticking your fingers in your ears and going LALALAICA on tear you when someone tries to tell you about global warming. Parmenides wrote a poem about his philosophical journey where he claimed a goddess revealed the truth to him because apparently even ancient philosophers knew that saying a divine being told me was the best way to shut down arguments. It's the original my girlfriend goes to another school. You wouldn't know her except for cosmic truth instead of dating lies. The real comedy comes from imagining these guys at ancient Greek philosophy conferences. Picture Heraclitus in the corner weeping about change while Parmenides stands nearby insisting that nothing ever changes. Meanwhile, Thales is trying to explain how the conference table is actually made of water, while Anaximenes insists it's compressed air. It's like a philosophy convention organized by people who've never read philosophy but have very strong opinions about it anyway. And the cherry on top of this intellectual sundae, Empedocles, who looked at all the single-element theories and said, why choose one when you can have four? This guy invented the four-element theory, earth, air, fire, and water, which at least had the benefit of being 4 times as wrong as the single-element theories. He also believed in reincarnation and claimed to remember his past lives, including being a bush. A bush. This man thought he used to be landscaping and somehow convinced people this made him wise. Empedocles eventually jumped into Mount Etna because he wanted people to think he was immortal and had ascended to godhood. Instead, the volcano spat out one of his sandals, basically giving him the ancient world's first fail video. It's like if someone today tried to fake their own ascension by jumping into a volcano and accidentally live-streamed it on TikTok. The Midnight Meme historian appreciates that even 2,500 years ago people were dying for internet clout. But here's what really gets me. We're still teaching this stuff in schools. Philosophy departments across the world spend time seriously discussing whether everything is made of water or air, as if these are viable competing theories rather than the ramblings of people who clearly had too much time and too little understanding of basic chemistry. It's like having entire university courses dedicated to debating whether the earth is carried on the back of a giant turtle or a really big elephant. Just when you thought ancient Greek philosophy couldn't get any more ridiculous, along came the Sophists, basically the world's first motivational speakers, except instead of selling you overpriced seminars about success, they sold rich kids overpriced lessons about how to win arguments without actually being right. These guys were like the ancient equivalent of those LinkedIn influencers who post inspirational quotes over stock photos of sunsets, except with more togas and fewer hats. The Sophists figured out something that modern politicians and social media gurus still use today. It doesn't matter if you rewrite, it only matters if you can convince people you're right. They were like, why spend years studying the nature of reality when you can just learn to argue so well that reality becomes whatever you say it is? It's the intellectual equivalent of gaslighting, but make it philosophy. Protagoras, the OG sophist, gave us the famous line, "Man is the measure of all things," which sounds profound until you realize what he's actually saying is truth is whatever you want it to be. Bro, this is the philosophical foundation of every conspiracy theory, every alternative facts, political speech, and every person who's ever argued that pineapple belongs on pizza. He basically invented relativism 24 centuries before it became trendy on college campuses. The guy also claimed he could make the weaker argument stronger, which is basically the mission statement of every defense attorney, political spin doctor, and internet troll who ever lived. He was teaching rich Athenian kids how to argue their way out of anything. Traffic tickets, business contracts, murder charges. It's like ancient Greece's first law school, except they were honest about teaching people how to lie professionally. But the absolute mad lad of the sophist crew was Togas, who argued that nothing exists, and if it did exist, you couldn't know it. And if you couldn't know it, you couldn't communicate it. This guy basically deconstructed the entire concept of knowledge and reality as a party trick. It's like philosophical nihilism with a side of performance art. He was basically saying everything is meaningless, including this argument I'm making about everything being meaningless, but give me money anyway. Gorgias was also famous for his elaborate rhetorical style, using fancy words and complex sentence structures to make simple ideas sound profound. He was like the ancient world's first TED Talk speaker, except instead of talking about innovation and disruption, he was talking about how we can't actually talk about anything meaningful. Modern corporate consultants owe this man everything. He invented the art of saying absolutely nothing in the most impressive way possible. The Sophists also introduced the concept of moral relativism, arguing that there's no universal right or wrong, just cultural customs that vary from place to place, which would be a reasonable philosophical position if they were using it to justify charging outrageous fees to teach wealthy teenagers how to get away with anything. It's like if your ethics professor started every class by saying morality is relative. Now here's how to cheat on your taxes. These guys were so good at their job that they made Socrates look like an amateur. Remember, Socrates went around asking questions for free like some kind of philosophical street performer, while the Sophists were charging premium rates for custom-tailored arguments. They were the ancient world's first consultants, expensive, effective, and morally questionable. The really hilarious part is that sophist became a dirty word precisely because these guys were too successful. They were so good at making bad arguments sound convincing that people started using sophisticated as an insult, meaning overly complex and misleading. We literally still use their name to describe bullshit disguised as intelligence. That's quite a legacy, being so effectively awful that your profession becomes synonymous with intellectual dishonesty. But here's the thing that really twists your noodle. The Sophists were probably more honest about what they were doing than any of the other philosophers. While Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were pretending they were seeking eternal truth and cosmic wisdom, the Sophists were upfront about being in it for the money and the intellectual flexing. They were like, yeah, we're teaching people how to argue better and win more debates. That'll be 50 drachmas, please. Modern academia could learn something from the Sophists' honesty. Instead of pretending that philosophy departments are pursuing pure knowledge, they could just admit they're teaching people how to sound smart at dinner parties and write really long essays about nothing in particular. At least the Sophists delivered practical skills. After taking their classes, you could actually go out and convince people of things, even if those things were complete nonsense. The conflict between Socrates and the Sophists was basically the ancient world. As first culture war between real intellectuals and fake intellectuals, Socrates positioned himself as the authentic truth seeker, while painting the Sophists as sellouts who corrupted young minds for profit. It's like the eternal battle between real artists and commercial sellouts, except with more existential angst and fewer record deals. But let's be real here. Who was actually more useful to society? Socrates, who spent his life asking annoying questions that nobody could answer, or the Sophists who taught practical communication skills that people could actually use in their daily lives? Sure, the Sophists were basically teaching ancient Greeks how to be better at bullshitting, but at least they were preparing them for the real world where bullshitting is a valuable skill. The Sophists understood something that pure philosophers often miss. Most people don't actually care about eternal truth or the nature of reality. They care about winning arguments, getting what they want, and looking smart in front of their peers. The Sophists were the first philosophers to admit that philosophy is often just intellectual masturbation dressed up as wisdom-seeking. And honestly, looking at modern political discourse, social media debates, and corporate communications, it's pretty clear that the Sophists won in the end. We live in a world where rhetoric matters more than truth, where perception is reality, and where the ability to argue convincingly is more valuable than being actually correct. Every time someone goes viral for a clever comeback tweet, every time a politician dodges a question with linguistic acrobatics, every time a CEO explains why mass layoffs are actually good for employees, the sophist tradition living on the midnight meme historian has to respect the Sophists for being the first philosophers to figure out that philosophy is mostly a performance art designed to make people feel superior to others. They just cut out the pretense and went straight to monetizing intellectual superiority. In a way, they were more honest than anyone else in the ancient philosophical scene. They knew they were full of shit. They knew their students were full of shit, and they charged accordingly. So the next time someone accuses you of being a sophist, just remember, you're being compared to the ancient world's most successful entrepreneurs, who figured out how to make a fortune by teaching people the most valuable skill in human civilization: how to sound like you know what you're talking about, even when you absolutely don't. After watching the Sophists turn philosophy into a get-rich-quick scheme and the early philosophers argue about whether reality was made of water or cosmic fire, some Greeks decided what the world really needed was a philosophy that would help people stop giving a damn about anything. Enter the Stoics, the ancient world's first self-help gurus, except instead of promising you happiness, they promised you wouldn't feel anything at all. It's like Buddhism for people who think Buddhism is too cheerful. The Stoics looked at human suffering and said, you know what would solve this? Just stop caring about things. It's the philosophical equivalent of that friend who responds to all your problems with, have you tried not being sad? Except they built an entire school of thought around this revolutionary concept and somehow convinced people it was profound wisdom rather than emotional numbness, masquerading as enlightenment. Zeno of Citium founded Stoicism after being shipwrecked and losing all his possessions. His response to losing everything wasn't to grieve or rebuild, it was to create a philosophy based on not wanting things in the first place. It's like if someone got dumped and instead of eating ice cream and crying, they started a support group called Dating is Overrated Anyway. The man literally turned his personal trauma into a lifestyle brand. The Stoics taught that the only things we can control are our thoughts and reactions, which sounds reasonable until you realize they extended this to literally everything. Your house burns down. That's just external circumstances. Bro, your family dies in a plague. Well, you can't control disease, so why be upset? It's the ancient equivalent of toxic positivity, except instead of telling people to look on the bright side, they told people to stop having sides altogether. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, spent his time writing down thoughts about how nothing matters and everything is temporary while simultaneously running a massive empire and making decisions that affected millions of lives. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Imagine if modern world leaders spent their time tweeting about how worldly power is meaningless while launching drone strikes and signing trade deals. Just bombed another country. But remember guys, attachment to outcomes is the root of suffering. #Stoic life, #mindful warfare. Epictetus, who started as a slave and became one of Stoicism's greatest teachers, had perhaps the most reasonable excuse for developing a philosophy of emotional detachment. When your entire early life is spent being literally owned by another person, just don't care about external circumstances starts to make sense as a survival strategy. But then wealthy Romans started adopting his ideas as a lifestyle choice, which is like trust fund kids reading about poverty and deciding that not having money sounds spiritually fulfilling. The Stoics divided everything into three categories: things you can control, things you can't control, and things you can influence, which would be useful life advice if they had defined things you can control as basically just your thoughts and attitude. Everything else, your health, your relationships, your career, whether your Wi-Fi works when you need to stream something, all external circumstances that a proper Stoic shouldn't worry about. It's like Marie Kondo for emotions, except instead of asking if something sparks joy, you ask if something is within your direct control, and if not, you throw it in the emotional trash. Seneca, the wealthy Roman statesman who wrote extensively about Stoic virtue, while also being one of the richest men in the empire, is basically the ancient world's first lifestyle invalid. This guy wrote letters about the importance of simple living while owning multiple villas and having more money than most small countries. It's like a billionaire writing self-help books about minimalism from their private jet. Money can't buy happiness, says the man who never had to worry about rent. The real comedy of Stoicism is that it became popular among the Roman elite, basically rich, powerful people adopting a philosophy that taught them not to care about being rich and powerful. It's the ultimate philosophical flex. I'm so wealthy and important that I can afford to pretend wealth and importance don't matter. Modern Silicon Valley executives do the same thing when they talk about work-life balance, while sending emails at 3 a.m. and naming their kids after Wi-Fi passwords. But But here's where Stoicism gets really weird. They believed in cosmic determinism, the idea that everything is predetermined by divine reason. So not only should you not care about outcomes, but those outcomes were already decided anyway. It's like playing a video game where all the choices are scripted, but the game keeps telling you that the key to happiness is not caring about the choices you're not actually making. Free will, that's just an illusion, buddy. Moral responsibility, also predetermined. It's nihilism with better marketing. The Stoics also believed that emotions were judgments, not feelings. So if you're sad about something, it's not because something sad happened, it's because you judged the event as sad. When you should have remained emotionally neutral, it's victim blaming for feelings. Your dog died. Well, you chose to judge that as a negative event instead of accepting it as the natural order of things. This is the kind of logic that makes people want to punch philosophers, which the Stoics would probably say is just your judgment that punch-worthy behavior exists. Modern self-help culture loves to cherry-pick Stoic quotes about resilience and emotional control while completely ignoring the parts about cosmic determinism and emotional suicide. ULLC LinkedIn posts about Stoic mindset next to photos of expensive cars and luxury vacations, as if Marcus Aurelius would have been impressed by your quarterly sales figures. It's philosophy for people who want to feel deep without actually examining their lives. The Midnight Meme historian finds it hilarious that Stoicism has been rebranded as a productivity hack for entrepreneurs and life coaches. Ancient Stoics would have looked at modern Stoics' content and wondered why people were using their philosophy of universal indifference to justify caring deeply about business success and personal optimization. It's like using Buddhist meditation techniques to become better at capitalism. You're kind of missing the point. Ryan Holiday and other modern Stoicism popularizers have turned ancient emotional detachment into a lifestyle brand complete with journals, courses and merchandise. Nothing says I don't care about material possessions. Like buying a $100 leather-bound notebook to write down your thoughts about not caring about material possessions. It's the commercialization of anti-commercialism, which would probably make Seneca proud and Marcus Aurelius want to abdicate. The real test of Stoic philosophy is whether it helps you stay calm during traffic jams or business meetings. It's whether you can maintain that cosmic indifference when your internet goes down and you can't access your meditation app. Modern Stoics talk a big game about emotional resilience until their Uber driver takes a wrong turn or their favorite restaurant is out of the thing they wanted to order. But let's give credit where it's due. The Stoics at least tried to create a practical philosophy for dealing with life's inevitable suffering, while other schools were debating whether reality was made of fire or water. The Stoics were developing coping mechanisms for the fact that life generally sucks and then you die. They just took it too far in the other direction, turning emotional intelligence into emotional lobotomy. The ultimate irony of Stoicism is that it requires enormous emotional energy to maintain the appearance of not caring about anything. True emotional detachment would mean not caring enough about Stoic principles to follow them. The fact that Stoics care so much about not caring reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of their philosophy. You could unwill yourself into not having a will. Plus, let's be honest about what Stoicism actually produces in practice. Not enlightened sages who transcended human emotion, but people who are really good at intellectualizing their feelings instead of actually dealing with them. It's therapy for people who think therapy is for weaklings, self-help for people who are too proud to admit they need help. The ancient world's first emotional constipation, marketed as spiritual achievement. And yet somehow 23 centuries later, we're still buying books about how ancient Roman slave owners figured out the secret to happiness through strategic indifference. Maybe the real joke is on us for thinking that people who lived in a world without antibiotics, democracy or decent plumbing figured out something about mental health that we're missing. But hey, at least their philosophy helps modern people feel superior to their own emotions, which is apparently what passes for wisdom in an age where you can get life advice from apps. If you thought the Stoics were extreme in their rejection of worldly pleasures, wait until you meet the cynics, the ancient world's first punk rock philosophers, who decided that the best way to critique society was to become aggressively homeless and yell at people about their life choices. These guys looked at civilization and said, you know what this needs? More public urination and fewer social conventions. It's like if someone took modern internet trolling, removed the internet, and added a philosophical justification for being deliberately obnoxious in public spaces. Diogenes of Sinope, the most famous cynic, lived in a barrel in the marketplace and spent his days insulting passersby while masturbating in public. And before you ask, yes, people took this seriously as philosophy. He was basically the ancient world's first influencer, except instead of selling lifestyle products, he was selling the lifestyle of having no lifestyle at all. Imagine if someone today became famous on social media for living in a dumpster and posting videos about how everyone else was doing life wrong. That's essentially what Diogenes did, minus the monetization opportunities. The man called himself a citizen of the world, which sounds progressive and enlightened until you realize what he meant was, I reject all social responsibilities and will poop wherever I feel like it. He was like those digital nomads who brag about being location independent while freeloading off other people's infrastructure. Except Diogenes was honest about being a social parasite and made it part of his brand. Diogenes became famous for carrying a lamp during the day, claiming he was looking for an honest man. It's the kind of performance art that would go viral on TikTok today. Deliberately absurd behavior with a supposedly deeper meaning that's really just an excuse to get attention. He never found his honest man, which isn't surprising since he spent most of his time calling everyone idiots and masturbating in public. It's hard to attract quality people when your opening line is basically, "Hello, let me explain why your entire way of life is garbage while I pleasure myself." When Alexander the Great, yes, the same Alexander who studied under Aristotle, came to visit Diogenes, the philosopher was sunbathing. Alexander offered to grant him any wish, and Diogenes told him to move out of his sunlight. This story gets told as an example of cynic wisdom and independence. But let's be real. It's the ancient equivalent of someone telling a billionaire offering them $1 million to move because they're reblocking the Wi-Fi signal. It's not profound. It's just really good PR for antisocial behavior. The cynics believed that virtue was the only good thing and that virtue meant living according to nature. But their definition of nature apparently meant acting like feral animals with philosophy degrees. They rejected social conventions like marriage, property ownership, and basic hygiene, while lecturing everyone else about how to live properly. It's like getting life advice from someone who's never held a job, maintained a relationship, or used deodorant, but has very strong opinions about your choices. Crates of Thebes, another famous cynic, gave away all his money to become a wandering philosopher, which sounds noble until you learn that he had enough wealth to give away in the first place. Basically, he was a trust fund kid playing poverty for philosophical street cred. It's the ancient version of those celebrities who post Instagram photos about living simply from their second homes in Tuscany. Easy to reject material possessions when you already had them and know you could get them back if things get too uncomfortable. The cynics also practiced something called shamelessness, deliberately doing things that would embarrass normal people as a way of showing that social conventions were meaningless. This included eating, having sex, and relieving themselves in public. They were basically arguing that human dignity was a social construct, which is the kind of conclusion you might reach if you spent too much time thinking about philosophy and not enough time thinking about public health regulations. Antisthenes, who founded the Cynic school, was a student of Socrates who apparently took his teacher as criticism of social conventions and decided the logical response was to become a professional vagrant. He taught that happiness came from virtue, and virtue came from living like a dog, which is where the name cynic comes from, meaning dog-like. It's the only philosophical school named after an insult, which should tell you something about how their contemporaries viewed them. The cynics had a point about the artificial nature of many social conventions, but their solution was essentially to become philosophical performance artists whose entire act was shocking bourgeois sensibilities. It's like those modern artists who create challenging work by doing gross things in galleries and then acting superior when people are disgusted. Sure, you've proven that social norms are arbitrary, but you've also proven that you're insufferable to be around. Modern society has basically absorbed cynic philosophy and turned it into lifestyle content. Every minimalism blogger who brags about owning only 50 items, every van life influencer who posts about freedom, while clearly having family money as backup, every digital detox guru who sells courses about rejecting technology, they were all just cynics with better marketing and indoor plumbing. The really hilarious part is that the cynics became a recognized philosophical school with followers and teachings, which completely contradicts their supposed rejection of institutions and social structures. They created an anti-establishment establishment, a formalized system for being against formalized systems. It's like starting a non-profit called Down with Nonprofits or writing a best-selling book about why books are pointless. Diogenes supposedly died by holding his breath, which, if true, makes him the first philosopher to literally die from his own stubbornness. But more likely he died from the same things that kill most people who live in barrels and refuse basic medical care: disease, malnutrition, or exposure. The ancient world didn't have the same safety nets we do today, so living according to nature often meant dying according to nature too, which is usually painful and premature. But here's what the Midnight Meme historian finds most interesting about the cynics. They identified real problems with their society and proposed solutions that were technically correct but practically useless. Yes, many social conventions are arbitrary and serve the interests of the powerful. Yes, material possessions can become obstacles to genuine happiness. Yes, most people are hypocrites who don't live according to their stated values. But the cynic solution, become a homeless street preacher who insults everyone, doesn't actually fix any of these problems. It just makes you feel superior to them. The cynics were basically the ancient world's first edgelords, using philosophy as an excuse to be deliberately offensive and then claiming moral superiority when people got annoyed. Every internet troll who justifies their behavior by saying they were just telling uncomfortable truths or challenging people to think is following the cynic playbook. The only difference is that modern trolls don't have to live in barrels, which is probably why there are so many more of them. And let's talk about the gendered aspects of cynic philosophy that usually get glossed over in history classes. Most of the famous cynics were men who could get away with aggressive public behavior because ancient Greek society already gave men more freedom to be weird in public. A woman trying to live like Diogenes would have faced very different consequences. Less philosophical provocateur and more dangerous deviant who needs to be stopped. It's always easier to reject social conventions when those conventions were designed to control your specific demographic in the first place. The few female cynics we know about, like Hipparchia, are usually remembered more for their romantic relationships with male philosophers than for their own philosophical contributions. Because apparently even in a school of thought that rejected social conventions, some conventions were harder to shake than others. It's the philosophical equivalent of how female comedians today still get asked about being female comedians instead of just comedians. Modern libertarians and anarchists love to claim the cynics as intellectual ancestors, but they usually ignore the parts about giving up all possessions and living like animals. It's cherry-picking philosophy. Take the anti-establishment attitudes, leave the actual sacrifice and discomfort. It's much easier to rail against government overreach from your suburban home with high-speed internet than it is to actually live without the benefits of organized society. The ultimate irony is that cynic philosophy has become a lifestyle brand for people who want to feel rebellious without actually rebelling. You can buy books about cynic wisdom, attend workshops on simple living, and even get therapy based on cynic principles. The guys who rejected all forms of commerce and social organization have been turned into content for the very system they opposed. Diogenes is probably spinning in whatever unmarked grave they threw him in. But maybe that's the real lesson of the cynics. That even the most radical rejection of society eventually gets absorbed and monetized by that same society. Every counterculture becomes mainstream culture given enough time and marketing. The hippies became yoga instructors, the punks became fashion statements, and the ancient Greek homeless philosophers became self-help gurus for people who want to feel authentic, while keeping their day jobs. So the next time someone tells you they're reliving authentically or rejecting materialism while posting about it on their $1,000 phone, just remember, they're refollowing in the footsteps of ancient philosophers who turned being deliberately obnoxious into a spiritual practice. At least Diogenes was honest about being a public nuisance. Modern cynics pretend their lifestyle choices are helping humanity while carefully curating their image for maximum social media impact. The Epicureans and their philosophical hedonism. After watching the cynics turn poverty into performance art and the Stoics turn emotional numbness into wisdom, some Greeks decided what philosophy really needed was more pleasure. Enter Epicurus and his followers, who looked at all the other philosophical schools torturing themselves with questions about reality and virtue and said, you know what, let's just focus on feeling good. Finally, a philosophy that made sense to anyone who has ever chosen pizza over salad or binge-watched Netflix instead of doing something productive. But here's where it gets funny. Epicurus did mean the kind of pleasure that modern people think of when they hear Epicurean. We're not talking about cocaine-fueled orgies and champagne breakfasts. The guy was basically promoting the philosophical equivalent of a really nice spa day. His idea of ultimate pleasure was hanging out in a garden with friends, eating simple food, and having intellectual conversations without worrying about politics or death. It's like if someone today founded a philosophy based on high and mindful eating, then 23 centuries later people remembered it as an excuse for spring break behavior. The Garden of Epicurus was basically ancient Greece's first commune, except instead of growing their own vegetables and sharing everything, they were growing their own philosophy and sharing their anxiety about mortality. It was a mixed-gender community where people could live without the pressures of Athenian society, which was revolutionary for its time, and probably seems quaint to anyone who has ever been to Burning Man. They even allowed women and slaves to participate, which made them more progressive than most modern philosophy departments. Epicurus taught that the goal of life was to achieve ataraxia, a state of serene calmness free from disturbance, which sounds great until you realize that his method for achieving this was basically to avoid anything that might be upsetting, challenging, or inconvenient. Don't worry about politics because you can't control them. Don't fear death because you won't be there to experience it. Don't get too attached to people because loss is painful. It's less live your best life and more live your most comfortable life, while avoiding anything that might make you grow as a person. The famous Epicurean motto was, death is nothing to us, because when we exist, death is not present. And when death is present, we no longer exist. This is the kind of logic that sounds profound at 2 a.m. when you're having an existential crisis, but falls apart when you actually think about it. Sure, you won't experience being dead, but you will experience dying, and you will experience the fear of death, and everyone you care about will experience your death. It's like saying hangovers are nothing to us because when we're drunk we're not hungover, and when we're hungover we're not drunk anymore. But the real comedy gold in Epicurean philosophy is their atomic theory. Epicurus adopted the idea from Democritus that everything is made of tiny indivisible particles called atoms, which randomly swerve through the void, and occasionally bump into each other to form temporary combinations like trees, rocks, and people. It's actually pretty close to modern atomic theory. except for the part where atoms have free will and can randomly change direction whenever they feel like it. Apparently, even subatomic particles need agency in the Epicurean universe. This atomic swerve was Epicurus' solution to the problem of determinism. If everything is predetermined by the laws of physics, how can humans have free will? Easy atoms sometimes just randomly decide to go in different directions for no reason at all. It's solving the problem of traffic jams by claiming that cars sometimes spontaneously teleport to different lanes. Technically it would work, but it raises more questions than it answers. The Epicureans also believed that the gods exist but don't care about human affairs. The gods are perfectly happy living in their own divine pleasure gardens and couldn't be bothered with prayers, sacrifices, or moral judgments. It's like having parents who are too busy enjoying retirement in Florida to worry about what their adult children are doing. This was actually pretty radical for ancient Greece, where most people believed the gods were constantly meddling in human affairs and needed to be constantly appeased with offerings and festivals. Lucretius, the Roman poet who popularized Epicurean philosophy, wrote a long poem called On the Nature of Things that was basically ancient Rome's first science textbook disguised as poetry. He explained atomic theory, evolution, and natural phenomena without referencing supernatural causes, which was revolutionary for its time and probably would still upset certain school boards today. The guy was promoting scientific materialism while everyone else was sacrificing goats to ensure good weather. But Lucretius also spent a lot of time in his poem arguing against the fear of death, which suggests that even Epicurean philosophers weren't as chill about mortality as they claimed to be. When you have to write thousands of lines of poetry to convince yourself that death isn't scary, you're probably still pretty scared of death. It's like writing a 100-page manifesto about how you don't care what your ex thinks. The length of the argument suggests you care quite a bit. The misconception about Epicurean hedonism probably comes from later Roman interpretations of the philosophy. Romans looked at pleasure as the highest good and decided this meant party like it said 99. They turned Epicurus' careful distinction between kinetic pleasures, active enjoyment, and catastematic pleasures, peaceful contentment, into an excuse for elaborate dinner parties and sexual excess. It's like taking Buddha's teachings about the middle way and using them to justify moderate drug use and casual gambling. Modern self-help culture has done something similar with Epicurean ideas, turning seek pleasure and avoid pain into lifestyle advice for people who want philosophical justification for their consumer choices. Every wellness influencer who promotes treating yourself and living your truth is basically selling watered-down Epicureanism to people who never heard of the garden but definitely know about self-care Sundays. The Midnight Meme historian appreciates that Epicurus at least tried to make philosophy practical and enjoyable instead of a form of intellectual masochism. While other schools were competing to see who could make their followers more miserable, the Epicureans were actually trying to help people feel better about life. It's the philosophical equivalent of being the teacher who brings pizza to class, while all the other teachers are assigning extra homework. But there is something deeply ironic about a philosophy based on avoiding pain and disturbance, becoming one of the most misunderstood and controversial schools of ancient thought. The Christians later turned Epicurean into a synonym for godless hedonism, completely missing the point that Epicurus was trying to create a rational, ethical framework for human happiness. It's like if future historians remembered Mr. Rogers as a dangerous radical, because he suggested that children deserve to be treated with kindness. The real tragedy of Epicureanism is that it offered a genuinely humane alternative to the harsh philosophies of its time, but got reduced to a caricature of indulgence and excess. While the Stoics were teaching people to suppress their emotions, and the Cynics were teaching people to reject society, the Epicureans were teaching people to build communities based on friendship, kindness, and mutual support. In a world full of philosophical systems designed to make people feel bad about being human, they created one that actually liked humanity. But let's be honest about why Epicureanism never really caught on as a major philosophical movement. It's too reasonable and not dramatic enough. People want their philosophy to be either extremely demanding like Stoicism, or extremely rebellious like Cynicism. A philosophy that basically says, be nice to your friends, don't worry about things you can't control, and try to enjoy simple pleasures doesn't make people feel special or superior. It's philosophical vanilla ice cream, perfectly good, but not exciting enough to build an identity around. Modern attempts to revive Epicurean philosophy usually focus on the pleasure-seeking aspects, while ignoring the community-building and intellectual development parts. You'll find plenty of articles about Epicurean living that recommend expensive restaurants and luxury experiences, completely missing the point that Epicurus thought the best pleasures were free and simple. It's like taking a philosophy based on contentment and turning it into another form of consumerism. The Epicureans also had some surprisingly modern ideas about mental health. Recognizing that anxiety and depression were real problems that could be addressed through philosophy and community support, they created what was essentially an ancient therapy group where people could work through their fears and insecurities in a supportive environment. Meanwhile, most other philosophical schools were telling people that negative emotions were either illusions to be ignored or weaknesses to be overcome through willpower. If you had to choose an ancient Greek philosophical school to join, the Epicureans would probably be your best bet for actually enjoying the experience. Sure, you wouldn't get the intellectual prestige of being a Platonist or the rugged individualism of being a cynic, but you'd probably have better mental health and more genuine friendships. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is choose the philosophy that doesn't make your life worse, but even the Epicureans couldn't escape the fundamental problem of all ancient philosophy. They were still a bunch of privileged people with too much time on their hands trying to solve universal human problems through abstract reasoning. The garden might have been more pleasant than Plato's academy or Diogenes' barrel, but it was still a retreat from the real world where most people had to work for a living and couldn't afford to spend their days contemplating the nature of pleasure and happiness. The skeptics and their professional doubt. Just when you thought ancient Greek philosophy had covered every possible way to make simple questions unnecessarily complicated, along came the skeptics to argue that we can't actually know anything for certain, so we might as well stop trying. These guys looked at all the other philosophical schools fighting about ultimate truth and reality and said, what if nobody's right about anything? It's like being the person at a heated political debate who responds to every argument with, but how do we really know anything is real? You're technically correct, but you're also incredibly annoying and not helping resolve anything. Piero of Elis, the founder of skepticism, supposedly achieved perfect equanimity by suspending judgment on everything. Legend says he was so committed to not making assumptions about reality that he had to have followers guide him around because he wouldn't assume that cliffs were dangerous or that moving carts should be avoided. It's the philosophical equivalent of someone being so committed to not making judgments that they won't move out of the way of traffic because who's to say getting hit by a car is bad? The goal of skepticism was the suspension of judgment that leads to ataraxia or unperturbable tranquility. Basically, if you stop believing anything is true, you'll stop being upset when things don't go your way. It's like achieving inner peace through intellectual paralysis. Sure, you won't be disappointed by reality anymore, but you also won't be able to function in reality anymore, which seems like a pretty steep trade-off for emotional stability. Sextus Empiricus, who wrote down most of what we know about skeptical philosophy, created elaborate arguments for why we can't trust our senses, our reason, or our memory. He was like a one-man wrecking crew for the concept of knowledge, systematically dismantling every possible way humans might learn about the world. Reading his work is like watching someone spend hours explaining why hammers don't exist while using a hammer to nail boards together. The skeptics developed what they called tropes, standard arguments for doubting different types of knowledge claims. There's the trope of infinite redress. Every proof requires another proof, which requires another proof, forever. The trope of circular reasoning. You can't prove logic without using logic. And the trope of relative judgment. Everything seems different from different perspectives. It's like having a philosophical toolkit specifically designed for making productive conversations impossible. One of their favorite techniques was equivalence, showing that for every argument supporting something, there's an equally strong argument against it. So if someone says the sun rises in the east, a skeptic would respond with, but from the sun's perspective, the earth rotates westward. So really the concept of rising is just human prejudice. They were basically ancient Greek devil's advocates, who forgot that the point of playing devil's advocate is eventually to reach a better understanding, not to prove that understanding is impossible. The academic skeptics, led by philosophers like Arcesilaus and Carnatus, took over Plato's academy and turned it into a factory for doubt. They argued against every philosophical position by showing that it led to contradictions or relied on unprovable assumptions. It's like if a university philosophy department decided their job wasn't to teach philosophy but to prove that philosophy was pointless. Students probably left their classes more confused than when they entered, which the professors counted as a success. Carnatus was famous for his ability to argue both sides of any issue with equal conviction. When he visited Rome as part of a diplomatic mission, he gave one speech defending justice and another speech the next day arguing that justice was impossible. The Romans were so disturbed by this that they kicked the entire Athenian delegation out of the city. It's like if a modern diplomat gave a speech about human rights one day and a speech about why human rights are meaningless social constructs the next day. Technically impressive, but probably not great for international relations. The new academy's skeptics claimed they were following Socrates' example of knowing that they knew nothing, but they took it much further than Socrates ever did. While Socrates used his ignorance as a starting point for inquiry, the academic skeptics used it as an ending point. It's the difference between saying, I don't know, let's figure it out, and I don't know, and neither do you, and nobody can know anything, so let's all just give up. Later skeptics tried to make their philosophy more practical by distinguishing between absolute knowledge, which is impossible, and practical reliability, which is good enough for daily life. So you can't prove that bread exists, but you can act as if it does when you're hungry. It's like being a philosophical pragmatist who insists on explaining why pragmatism is theoretically unjustifiable every time they make a practical decision. The midnight meme historian finds it hilarious that skepticism became a school of philosophy with doctrines, texts, and established teachings about how we can't have doctrines, texts, or established teachings. They created an institution dedicated to proving that institutions can't provide reliable knowledge. It's like starting a university called Why Universities Are Pointless and offering PhD programs in the impossibility of expertise. Modern philosophy departments love teaching skeptical arguments because they're intellectually sophisticated and practically useless. The perfect combination for academic philosophy. Students learn to doubt everything except their student loan debt, which apparently is immune to philosophical skepticism. You can question the existence of the external world, but you still have to pay for your education in that potentially non-existent world. The real problem with skepticism is that it's unlivable. Even the most committed skeptic has to make assumptions about reality to function. They have to assume their food isn't poisoned, their house won't collapse, and their friends exist. A true skeptic couldn't even teach skepticism, because they have to assume their students could understand language, which requires assuming shared reality and reliable communication. It's a philosophy that can only exist as an intellectual exercise, not as a way of life. But skepticism did serve one useful purpose. It forced other philosophers to strengthen their arguments and examine their assumptions. When someone challenges every aspect of your worldview, you have to either give up or get better at defending your position. The skeptics were like philosophical immune systems, making other schools of thought more robust by constantly attacking their weak points. The modern descendants of ancient skepticism include postmodernists who doubt objective truth, conspiracy theorists who doubt official narratives, and internet trolls who doubt everything except their right to have opinions about things they doubt exist. The tools of skeptical argument have been democratized and weaponized, turning philosophical sophistication into a way to avoid taking responsibility for beliefs or actions. Social media has turned everyone into a part-time skeptic, ready to demand proof for any claim they disagree with while accepting any claim that confirms their existing biases. It's selective skepticism. Doubt everything that challenges you, believe everything that flatters you. The ancient skeptics would probably be horrified to see their careful philosophical method turned into a tool for intellectual laziness and motivated reasoning. The ultimate irony is that skepticism, which was supposed to lead to tranquil suspension of judgment, has become a source of endless anxiety and conflict in the modern world. Instead of achieving, we've achieved a state where everyone doubts everything except their own doubt, leading to the kind of paralyzed confusion that makes productive conversation impossible and effective action unlikely. But maybe that's the real lesson of skepticism, that doubt is a tool, not a destination. Used properly, it can help us question bad ideas and avoid false certainties. Used improperly, it becomes a way to avoid the difficult work of figuring out what's actually true and acting on that knowledge. The ancient skeptics turned doubt into a lifestyle. Modern people have turned it into an excuse for intellectual irresponsibility. So the next time someone responds to a factual claim with, "But how do we really know anything?" you can thank 23 centuries of skeptical philosophy for training people to confuse being profound with being obstructive. At least the ancient skeptics were trying to achieve inner peace through radical doubt. Modern skeptics are usually just trying to win arguments by changing the subject to epistemology. Alright, you beautiful disasters, we've just taken a journey through 25 centuries of philosophical train wrecks disguised as wisdom. From Socrates annoying people to death, literally, to the skeptics proving that proving things is impossible, we've covered the greatest hits of ancient Greek thinking. And what have we learned? That humans have been overthinking simple questions and underthinking complex problems since the dawn of recorded history. These were unenlightened sages who unlocked the secrets of existence. They were just people with too much time, too little real-world responsibility, and enough privilege to turn their random thoughts into schools of thought. They were basically the ancient equivalent of podcast hosts, except with worse hygiene and better name recognition. But here's the thing that really gets me. We're still teaching this stuff like it's sacred wisdom instead of historical curiosity. Philosophy departments across the world spend millions of dollars and thousands of hours analyzing whether Plato's cave allegory reveals profound truths about reality, when it's really just an elaborate way of saying, things aren't always what they seem. Congratulations, Plato, you discovered that appearances can be deceiving. Here's your tenure. The midnight meme historian wants you to remember that philosophy, like everything else humans do, is mostly just smart people finding complicated ways to state obvious truths or stupid people finding impressive ways to state obvious lies. The difference between wisdom and bullshit often comes down to confidence, timing, and whether you can get other people to repeat your ideas after you die. So if you've made it this far without falling asleep or having an existential crisis, congratulations. You've just proven that you have a longer attention span than most of Socrates' victims and more intellectual courage than the average skeptic. Now go forth and remember that every time someone quotes ancient philosophy to sound deep, they're probably just trying to avoid taking responsibility for their own thoughts. And hey, If you enjoyed watching me absolutely destroy 25 centuries of intellectual tradition, maybe consider subscribing to see what other sacred cows I can turn into philosophical hamburger. Or do NT the skeptics would say, you can't really know if clicking that button will improve your life. And the Stoics would say it doesn't matter anyway because external validation is meaningless. But the Epicureans might point out that supporting creators who make you laugh is actually a simple pleasure that could enhance your overall happiness. So maybe the ancient Greeks weren't completely wrong about everything. Either way, remember that the only thing we can know for certain is that certainty is overrated, knowledge is probably impossible, and anyone who claims to have figured out the meaning of life is probably selling something. At least the ancient Greeks were honest about being confused. Modern people pretend they know what they read doing while ordering food through apps they don't understand, built by companies they've never heard of to be delivered by people they'll never meet. Progress.